Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Survey Says Yes, Procurement Can Add More Value. My name is Harry Bevan. I'm a research analyst here at World Commerce and Contracting. I'd now like to hand over to our experts for the day, Mike O'Brien, Molly Castellazzo, and we're also joined by WorldCC President, Tim Cummins. Tim, over to you.
Harry, thank you, and Mike, Molly, welcome to our conversation today. I must say I've been really looking forward to this webinar because I think the survey, the research that's gone behind it has brought out some really fascinating results and insights, perhaps some of them not a massive surprise, but others, and many, I think, which are extremely thought-provoking. So I'm really looking forward to not only our analysis of the data, but I suppose more importantly, our interpretation of that data. What does it mean? Where does it take us? What are those sources of emerging and evolving value? So with that, Molly, perhaps we can just hand over to you quickly for a sort of an overview of what it was we did to get this data.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks, Tim. I'm glad to be here as well with you and Mike and our attendees. So we started off, with this hypothesis that perhaps there was a disconnect between procurement practitioners' perceptions of the value that they add and stakeholders, business stakeholders, C-suite, business unit leaders, etc. Perhaps there was a disconnect between perceptions of value. And so we thought if there's a disconnect, sort of where is that? Where is it arising? And really our thinking behind that was, is procurement, here we are in 2021, is procurement adding the kind of value to the business that business stakeholders are really looking to procurement to add? Are there activities that procurement is spending time on that perhaps aren't as value added as some other activities could be? And if that's the case, if procurement could spend less time on those sort of less value added or non-value added activities, could they spend more time on higher value added activities, and what would those be? So those were really the questions that we sought to answer in these two surveys. And what I think our audience is really going to find today is a lot of the interesting insights come out of some differences and indeed similarities between what procurement practitioners have to say and what stakeholders have to say. So we did two surveys, one of procurement, both executives and practitioner level folks, and stakeholders, CIOs, CEOs, COOs, and CFOs.
So to be clear, Molly, this wasn't saying that, procurement practitioners are just wasting their time doing completely unnecessary things. It was much more that a lot of the necessary things are done perhaps at the expense of opportunities to do even more valuable things. It might bring you in on that as a seasoned and experienced CPO. Would you say that is what you have generally encountered?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, there are the things that we do in the background that may be important to us, but there's also, you have to be cognizant of, what your stakeholders see and what's important to them as well. And you have to find that kind of that balance, that sweet spot between the two. And then I think you also have to always question our processes that are old and, that you've done, for the last 20 years. Has that changed? Is there, do you still need to do that? Or is there a different way actually you could look at doing that in the future?
So now to build, Molly, a little bit on the point you just made of the two surveys, this was the profile, yeah?
Yep. So at the practitioner level, kind of evenly split between sort of manager level procurement practitioners and then higher level. We had a few CPOs in there, some SVPs, VPs. So kind of an even split across the procurement continuum in terms of, the insights that we got from practitioners. And then on the stakeholders side, mostly CEOs here, and then kind of mostly CEOs, and then kind of an even split between CFOs, CIOs, and COOs, but C-suite level stakeholders.
Yeah, certainly people whose opinion tends to matter to us, eh?
Absolutely.
All right, so one of the big questions, and of course it features in the title of our presentation today, is that issue of lead time. I mean, one of the big frustrations for many people is it all just takes too long. So what do we discover there? Anything that's of note here?
Yeah, so what we're looking at here on this chart, we actually asked this question for 3 levels of complexity because, of course, a lower level complexity contract process will be quite different, we assumed or suspected, than a higher level complexity process, and that was indeed the case. So the most respondents, and this question was asked just to practitioners, so most of the procurement practitioner respondents said for lower level complexity contracts, we're talking less than 14 days. Medium complexity, 31 to 90 days, and high complexity, 91 to 180 days. So those were, the bulk of the responses in those various categories. Similar for the low level complexity contracts, a similar percentage of respondents said 15 to 30. So we could look at, sort of.
And just to be clear, Molly, this was the time taken to do what? I'm a bit afraid maybe Molly has maybe frozen. I guess must be cold in San Francisco with that bridge behind her. Mike, do you recall precisely what it is that we were talking about here in terms of the cycle time?
I think it was the cycle time from start to finish for each of the complexity deals. So I think what was interesting to me was the low complexity being, less than 14. In my experience, that's great. And I think from start to finish, I would say that looks high. So maybe in my background, maybe my teams were just really slow, but that's good to see. I kind of look at the numbers, and I think for low complexity, somewhere between 14 and 30 days seems reasonable to me. But it's good that 40% said it's less than 14. That means that I think we're getting better at turning around those lower complexity areas. I think what's interesting is the medium and high complexity. When you start getting into that 3 to 6 months to longer than 6 months, I think that's where things start to get relationship, and there begins to be friction points between the supplier, the customer, and the customer stakeholders.
And I guess it would be fair to say, Mike, of course, there's tended to be much more focus on automation down at low complexity, and which obviously, if it's good automation, and an increasing amount of it probably is, that would be having a pretty beneficial effect on that cycle time.
No, absolutely, and I think that's what's kind of good to see. And I think if you see automation starting to take over some of those, from a complexity scale, from the lower complexity to the higher complexity, it will be interesting to see what this chart looks like, a year from now, 2 years from now, and how things maybe shift a little bit to the left.
Always an interesting question, of course, to ask. Is it the deal that's complex, or is it having people involved that makes it complex? So from there, we move into the question then of how do stakeholders see things, and was their view of the cycle time significantly different from that of the practitioners? I think very often, obviously, people say, oh, it all takes too long. Is that a perception of truth or reality or not? And is it just a myth that things take as long as they do? And here, of course, interesting because actually the variation in view of practitioner and stakeholder was not perhaps as great as we'd have expected.
Yeah, no, it looks very similar, and even the stakeholders think it's even faster than the practitioners. So I thought that was kind of interesting, especially for the low complexity. So I mean, I think in that situation, I think automation probably is taking hold a little bit, and people are, they may have anticipated that it would take 30 days for low complexity, and now it's taking less. So I think the satisfaction in that area is definitely interesting to see coming through in the numbers.
Now, obviously, the importance of speed is to some extent dependent on the nature of the acquisition, isn't it? I mean, not all acquisitions are equal.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I think if you're just buying a widget that you bought, hundreds of times and it's part of a catalog, it is very low complex and easy to execute. Whereas if you're buying services, would be, far more complex and need, further articulation of requirements and agreement between the parties. And that's where I think where we see, most of the friction and the timing is the devil's in the details. And I think that's where I think we want to try to tackle is how do you actually streamline and remove some of those friction points and make it actually easy for the transaction to actually occur, and pre-contract and post-contract, and how do you make the contracts be more consumable for both the supplier and the customer. Because we do, even looking at this, we spend so much time creating these contracts that are seldom used or viewed after they are agreed. And my view is in the future, those should be much more consumable and open for everybody to understand what's been agreed between the parties, instead of actually trying to feel your way through the dark as to what seems logical to you that would be included and what logically would be excluded. Because I'll say often that's not how they're written. So I would like to see that in the future, is that all this time, you can just see it just on this page, all this time spent creating these deals, we should be able to use those and make them more consumable and accessible to all the parties involved in the service or the transaction.
Now, of course, an important factor that can get hidden in data like this is potential movement between these categories of complexity. I mean, I was just actually came to this webinar straight from a call with one of the big automotive OEMs, talking on exactly that point, that the nature of what they're acquiring continues to evolve. And they, in fact, use this low, medium, high complexity designator to determine how and where transactions get done, and obviously the nature of the skills that get deployed. But, they're finding the workload continues to grow because, in fact, quite a lot of things that perhaps used to be low have now moved to medium, and some of the medium has moved to high, particularly as we move more into a services world, where, of course, the importance of clarity of requirement, definition of scope, etc., takes on a much, much greater importance than traditional commodity acquisition. I mean, I suppose infrastructure as a service would be an example. Very different entering into a long-term agreement for IT infrastructure versus going out and buying a load of laptop computers.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think IT infrastructure deal is a good parallel to probably the most complex that you would see, because all of the requirements are almost required to be written down and articulated in a way that says how it's going to be done, when, how often it's going to be done, and what the acceptance criteria is versus, well, if you were buying, just a widget, you don't need that level of definition.
So now, Molly, I'm not sure whether you're back with us, but please do jump in at any point if you're.
I am, and I apologize to everyone. I am back, and I should be fine for now. My phone got too hot, apparently. So in this question, we in addition to the two sort of higher level questions that we just looked at, we wanted to ask the procurement practitioners specifically a bit more detail around the various steps in the process, so that we could assess where those choke points might be and where the biggest areas of opportunity to really reduce the time might be. And so what this is showing us is that, it looks like for low complexity contracts, it seems like each step in the process is a pretty similar amount of time. For medium complexity contracts, it looks like potentially step 2, agreeing on the scope of work, finalizing the requirements, issuing the RFP, that could potentially be a choke point in the process. And then really it's the high complexity contracts where we see a bit more of the differences in in timing on the various steps of the process. And it looks like, step 4 here is really where potentially our choke point is negotiating the solution terms and conditions. And so if we look across, low, medium, and high complexity contracts, it appears that overall reducing the time that steps 4 and 5, the negotiation, the scoring of suppliers, that could potentially reduce the overall process time by 120 days. So there's some real significant opportunity there in particular.
Yeah, well, certainly I would agree. I think steps 2 and 4 are where so much time tends to get absorbed. And of course, the quality of the work in probably both, actually, to be fair, in both step 1 and step 2 has a very real impact, I guess, on step 4 in terms of how much time you spend going back and having to do rework because you discover that actually you didn't get the scope right or the requirements were not adequately clear. So there are obviously strong correlations between this, and our research has in the past shown that actually the more time that is spent on step 1 and 2, often the less time you need to spend in these subsequent phases. But as we look at a topic like negotiation, I think it's again really interesting. A couple of things, and Mike, it would be great to get your thoughts on this. A couple of things that we've often observed with negotiation is that many times procurement tend to get given a standardized template by the legal department and perhaps lack meaningful authority to negotiate significant components of that agreement. So it drives a dependency on legal. And often those templates are rigid and perhaps not really attuned to what we're trying to buy today. I mean, I think an obvious example of that, certainly from our research, would be something like cloud agreements, where many times procurement will try and procure cloud under, for example, a standard MSA, Master Services Agreement, and there really isn't a good fit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we see a lot of. Some of the approaches that we've taken is really understanding what's actually acceptable. So having rigid instructions from legal is sometimes not helpful if it always leads to the negotiations going back to legal. Really understanding actually what's acceptable for your company is really important. So a rigid, overreaching template is really no help. It just frustrates the process, because if the parties would never sign up for it anyways, you're wasting a lot of time trying to reach the middle. And so what I find is sometimes, and I think Tim, you and I talked about this before, is that if legal gives you a rigid, overreaching document and no real fallback positions that would be acceptable, it just ends back up with legal. And what they're trying to prevent is actually what they're creating, which is more work for themselves. And so what I think with technology that can be used today, similar to what we do, is to just understand what's acceptable for your company. And then you can short circuit a lot of this by just cutting to the chase and just sharing what's acceptable, and let's move on, because that's where you're going to end up anyways. So I would advise, my recommendation is that the technology is out there today, and we're seeing tremendous amount of reduction in these steps by using technology. Where I was formerly removed from 3 to 6 months to do some of these medium and high complexity deals, down to as little as 24 hours or 8 days, by using technology that's out there. Just to kind of show the art of the possible that's out there, just by thinking a little bit differently about the processes and how you implement them.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, I think we're seeing some exciting breakthroughs with technology as we begin to look at artificial intelligence, natural language processing. We can begin to, in fact, we've been running some experiments over the last few weeks, pitching physical negotiation teams versus teams that are utilizing a machine. And where they never meet. And in fact, we've again reinforced the point we made at the beginning. Very often in the introduction of people makes things a lot more complicated than it needs to be. Because of course our negotiation behaviors depend so much on how much we trust the counterparty, how open we are with our data exchange. We do create a lot of barriers to achieving value, don't we?
No, I totally agree. And I think we're going to see some of those as we go further into the data here, and maybe we can cover some of that with some of the background data.
I'm also conscious that, Harry, I think we had a poll somewhere around here. I'm not sure quite whether we have in fact reached our poll, so we can carry on chatting for a moment while our audience tells us what they think about their state of play with their stakeholders. Are your stakeholders in general happy with how long procurement takes? And again, I think it's always important to bear in mind that this isn't an indictment of procurement as a function. It's much more a commentary, I think, Mike, on the quality, integrity, and the investment that's been made in the process, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And I think it's also the communication and education of what the role of procurement is, versus just to transact. I think it's that communication and education, that time to explain what your role actually is, that really impacts, I think, in my experience, the perception of your stakeholders.
That is a really interesting point. In fact, a study we've been undertaking just recently, that will be released in the next 2 or 3 weeks, reinforces that confusion. The acquisition life cycle, if you like, and certainly we tend to look at, of course, with terminology of the contracting process. But for us, like with you, like with this study here, does begin way back with the original requisition and goes all the way through. Well, obviously there's a milestone at signature, but of course there are further milestones way beyond that. But the clarity over who is responsible for doing what, who actually has decision rights, is often very murky, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. One of the things I would always do is kind of build a RACI model of where or a RACIC model as who has the decision rights, and at what point the decision rights kind of change from supplier selection to actually awarding of the contract. That it needs to be kind of balanced between procurement and the stakeholders as the decision rights and how to run the process versus the award and the selection.
So Harry, let's see what our audience thinks. So well, pretty much a dead heat actually, slightly more. I guess 34% who say dissatisfied or very dissatisfied versus 32% who feel they're satisfied, and 35% neither one way nor the other.
Right.
Is that a surprise for us, Molly?
No, well, I mean, I think we'll see as we look at the data, the survey data, that actually the poll now was very consistent with what we saw in the surveys, that when we asked that question of procurement practitioners, you know, how satisfied are your stakeholders? So that's really a question about the perception procurement practitioners have of their stakeholder satisfaction. Actually quite similar to the poll that we just saw, you know, about 50% very dissatisfied or dissatisfied. You know, here less than a quarter were satisfied or very satisfied. But interestingly, when and this is I think one of the most interesting insights that came out of having those two surveys kind of juxtaposed, that when we asked stakeholders, how satisfied are you with the procurement process? In fact, just 29% said dissatisfied. No one said very dissatisfied. So it suggests that there is a real difference probably in perception of satisfaction and actual stakeholder satisfaction. Still, of course, among stakeholders, you know, there is still an opportunity to improve satisfaction, you know, get that 7% very satisfied up a bit. But again, you know, interesting to see that juxtaposition, which is really a perception issue. And I think that we'll see in some future slides as we look deeper at the data, when we look at some comments made by practitioners as well as stakeholders, we'll see that this perception issue could be in fact driving a lot of the results that we're seeing, that it's a misperception, and that goes probably to the communication point that Mike made.
And important, of course, to bear in mind that this is satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the time it takes, not necessarily with the output or outcome that is achieved, the two being, of course, potentially very different. So what about then some steps that could be taken to shorten the process?
Yeah, so this question was asked on the practitioner survey as well. So again, if we think of those 7 steps that we laid out, we said, okay, what are the 3 that you, procurement practitioner, would most like to shorten? And what are the 3 that you think your stakeholders would most like to shorten? Interesting that the practitioner's own top 3 was exactly the same as the top 3 steps that they think stakeholders would like to shorten. And these are, you know, also kind of those, if we recall back to the slide where we looked at the timelines for each of those, you know, those are the areas where the greatest percentage of the time is spent.
And so building on that point that cycle time is not everything, we move now to look at actually where are the real value opportunities. And here we begin to see some quite interesting contrasting data, really, don't we?
Yeah, so this, what we're looking at here was this question asked just to practitioners. We'll look at the same question asked to stakeholders, but for practitioners, the question was, you know, what is the highest value that procurement delivers to the organization? cost savings was, pretty significantly the number one response that practitioners gave. If we look at the top three responses, cost savings, of course, still business risk mitigation, and quite a bit lower, but still top three is deal value. So what this shows is the perception of practitioners themselves of the value that procurement delivers really being centered around cost savings and risk mitigation.
I think that resonates. What I think that's where you think, where I would expect that most practitioners would say was most important. I think in contrast, I'd like to see what the stakeholders say, and then maybe Tim and I can maybe give a little bit of context.
Yeah, because certainly there are a few things that are definitely missing. And of course, people didn't really have a multiple choice here. They had to choose something. But, certainly interesting, for example, that on the left hand, nobody chose innovation, which obviously, if you read many business reports and many executive priorities, that would be right up there, wouldn't it? So what did the stakeholders tell us, Molly?
Yeah, so great tee up there, Tim. And certainly what we see here is that stakeholders, if we look at the number one response, and to your point, we asked people to rank the top five. So they had to rank them, none was an option. But if we look at the number one response, it's contribution to revenue growth tied with innovation. So here we are looking at much more, or stakeholders are saying the highest value procurement delivers. We're looking at much more sort of strategic responses. If we look at top three, cost savings does come up, risk mitigation does come up, but again, along with some of those other innovation, contribution to revenue growth, supplier selection, areas of value.
I think the interesting thing, Molly, here is, and I think the view of the stakeholders, this is always, as a CPO, this is always what got kind of pushed back to me as to what was important to the business. And I would, if I were to guess what would be important to the stakeholders, it would look very much like this. But if I were to ask what's important to practitioners, cost saves comes up, because it's really it's an easy thing to measure, right? And it's something that we hold on to in the procurement world as a way to measure our performance. But if I gave somebody a $500 million target, I'm pretty sure that they would make it, because you can, folks will find a way to count savings and make target, which doesn't help. But also, I would always say, from the stakeholder point of view, they would, I had always an issue with folks recognizing cost saves. And we've had some, with many CFOs, I've had many interesting conversations about, well, what part of the savings didn't occur? Because I would always go through a process of actually making their team audit the saves. And what you find out is whatever saves are made by procurement never get taken out of the budget. So as things rise up through the organization, if I saved $1 million on a deal, well, that $1 million would just, wouldn't come out of anybody's budget. It wouldn't show up as a save on the bottom line. It would just get spent elsewhere. And therefore, there's that perception and miscommunication of, the work that was actually done. But, this is kind of where also I think timeline and the speed to contract comes into play. Is, I know where I used to work, one of the things was procurement was seen as a barrier to innovation. It took too long. It was too hard to deal with us. So along the innovation, it was taking too long to actually get, innovative companies in to inject that new way of working, a new way of thinking, to get access to that technology. So speed to contract was key. And what you need to do is build that relationship with the stakeholders to get to that speed of the contract, but also to make sure that the quality is there as well. Because your stakeholders just want it, they know what they want, and they want it tomorrow. And the risk, they just don't necessarily always have that lens, and that's where we need to step in. We need to balance that to look at what the stakeholders are looking at for the contribution to revenue growth, innovation, and compliance, and not so hold so much to cost savings, because that's a larger thing for them to accept, actually, that the number that you gave them is actually a real number. Until they start taking that out of the budget, it just gets spent elsewhere. So you have to focus on more things than just cost saves. I think we'll get into more of that data as we go through some of this information and slides.
Always so important to remember that if we don't have revenue, we don't need procurement. And of course, I think all business functions sometimes tend to lose sight of that. They perceive value in what they're doing in its own right, but if at the end of the day it isn't contributing to a business' ability to generate revenues, then of course it is going to be purely seen as a cost, and therefore something that, as an executive, I prefer to avoid if I possibly could. So I'm certainly not surprised to see that those C-level executives are pretty strongly focused on that issue of revenue growth. Okay,
And
back to you.
Great, thanks. And this actually, really points to what Mike just described, that in the comments that practitioners made within the surveys themselves, and then I was able to have some interviews with some of the procurement practitioners who reflected really exactly what Mike just described, that savings has historically been kind of the key benchmark for procurement, in part because or at least there's a perception that it is the easiest to measure. And we had some really interesting comments around this idea that, in order to kind of shift away from this focus on savings and a shift towards potentially, more strategic value areas like speed to innovation, like, contribution to the bottom line, that will really be a big shift for many organizations. So this question that we see, the pie chart, the question was, again, for procurement practitioners, do you believe your stakeholders understand the value that procurement brings to the organization? Interestingly, the overwhelming percentage of respondents said either, sometimes, or usually. But again, what we learned from the comments was that this was still, really focused on savings. So practitioners were saying, yes, I think our stakeholders understand the value, but that value was sort of those cost savings, risk mitigation type value points rather than the more strategic value points. And that's where the the differences, or I think it would be fair to say breakdowns between stakeholders and practitioners might come in.
And again, I suppose important to note that they might understand the value you bring to the organization, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they appreciate it all that much. In other words, they might place greater value on something else. I think, quite interesting, obviously, one or two of these comments that talk about the fact that as far as the business units are concerned, they're often pretty skeptical about the whether those savings are realized. And certainly we've seen a lot of evidence that business units really look to procurement supply management groups that are much more front-end oriented, helping them much more with the requisitioning process, helping them to keep up with markets and alternatives. And then, of course, in ensuring that positive outcomes are actually delivered. whereas, of course, many procurement groups are still somewhat stuck in that central component of the actual procurement process, which is where that frustration can come from.
Yeah, I think people have to decide whether they want to be part of an expense function or a value generating strategic function within the business. And I think that's largely what how you differentiate yourself. But what I would say from being getting asked for a seat at the table and actually being more like the Department of Motor Vehicles, something you have to do versus something you want, you deem that you get value from and want to include.
So I guess the good news is that, and we've touched on this point, that modern procurement is certainly beginning to see some real opportunities to refocus its time and effort. And of course, for many, that can be a bit of frightening because, well, if I'm refocusing time and effort, A, have I got the skills? And B, will I actually be given the job? Is technology going to take my job? Or alternative way of looking at that, of course, is, as we've been discussing previously, it's an opportunity to refocus one's time into doing other things, and those other things have the potential perhaps of delivering much better, much different business value. So we're asking you here, and maybe some of you are already on this journey where perhaps through automation you're already freeing up time. So what would you spend, or what maybe are you spending your time on as you get more of it? An interesting set of choices here, I think, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting what people think. I think the one thing that to me seems missing from this is deepening relationships with the stakeholders, and I think that's something that would resonate for me.
So I don't know, Harry, we're at a point where we can share results. There we go. Molly, Mike, thoughts on this?
I think this looks
Yeah,
similar, Molly, to what we saw before.
it really does. I mean, we'll see when we look at the survey data that it's actually lays out maps quite similarly to what the practitioners we surveyed said in terms of sort of this desire to spend more time deepening strategic relationships with suppliers, focusing more on the requirements or the solution, as by far the two top areas of activity that practitioners would spend time on.
Interesting, though, of course, that raising skills comes number 3, the recognition, I guess, that for many, this transition is a pretty significant one. And certainly we've seen a big uptick in the numbers wanting to really learn more advanced, more complex contract management, as well as supplier relationship management. And we've seen organizations certainly starting to integrate the contract management and supplier relationship management role and activities. But if we are going to make that change, I wonder to what extent the number 1, deepening strategic relationship with suppliers, I wonder to what extent that's been influenced by the pandemic and the experience of the pandemic, the need to have stronger, better relationships in order to flex, to adapt, to be more agile. To what extent would you guess that this is in part a reaction to the pandemic, Mike?
I would say there's probably a significant weighting to that. I think the pandemic has pushed us towards having better relationships rather than transactional relationships with our suppliers, and having to deal with things that because of the pandemic aren't as readily accessible as they always have been. So the usual measurements of quality and goodness, I would say, between that relationship between customers and suppliers has changed. because it's become actually probably closer to the thing that we always talked about, which was partnership, and working together. I think we're actually testing that much more now than we ever have, as I don't think that there was truly that partnering type of relationship in the past.
So, well, what our survey respondents told us was pretty much in line with what our audience have told us, deepening strategic relationships with suppliers.
And I think that one interesting data point to note here is that, while cost savings and to a somewhat lesser extent business risk mitigation were the #1 highest value points that practitioners cited, the activities that practitioners say they would spend their time on are much more strategic. And I think that really goes to your comment, Tim, about none of this, of course, being any kind of indictment on procurement, but rather sort of a reflection of the reality, right? So if procurement practitioners really feel that they're measured on cost savings, then they're gonna, I would imagine, and this is certainly what I heard when I spoke with folks, they're gonna work to deliver cost savings. But if everyone from stakeholders to practitioners felt more free to look at some strategic value opportunities, deepening those relationships, focusing more on requirements, would be some of the areas of value that practitioners would prefer to focus on.
And let's just move on to this second slide, and maybe you can explain this one to us, Molly, and what we should be taking from this.
Yeah, so this question, we said, what would the impact to the business be if you were able to spend more time on those activities you just listed? Far and away, improved efficiency, #1. If we look at sort of the top 3, business risk mitigation shows up, improved supplier relationships. So essentially what practitioners are telling us here is that they perceive the value to the business would be improved efficiency, potentially, some business risk mitigation in there as well. Interesting to note, and again, I think this is the sort of the difference between maybe, sort of current state versus how practitioners wish it could be, that while cost savings was the #1 most cited value that procurement currently delivers, it's sort of its corollary, improved profitability, wasn't among the top 3 most cited impacts. Again, I think that just makes the point that practitioners would spend time and believe the impact would be in these kind of different areas of value than if they had the opportunity to kind of do something wholly different.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really fascinating list, and I think probably many of our audience today will probably be reflecting on these. I must say, I would potentially, looking at the chart here on the right-hand side of the screen, I'd almost reverse a lot of this, actually. I think probably for many businesses, improved profitability, reduction in resources needed, improved time to market and faster time to innovation might well be at the top of the list. Improved efficiency is in many respects an enabler of those values. It isn't something that necessarily has tremendous value in itself. And what people consider to be risk mitigation is interesting too, because for many businesses, again, the biggest risks are because of the time it takes them to get to market, or because they are not making enough profit. So it is, I think, an interesting cause and effect debate there, but I'm conscious that we need to accelerate through this. So what about our stakeholders?
Yeah, so then we asked a very similar question to stakeholders. If it were possible to shorten the process, what could the impact be? Improved efficiency, again, number one, kind of by far the most cited top impact. And then reduction in resources came up a little bit, seems potentially more important to stakeholders than to practitioners themselves. But again, sort of improved efficiency and improved profitability being top, both for practitioners as well as for stakeholders. We do see to exactly the point you just made, Tim, that if we look at the top three, faster time to innovation, improved time to market, do seem more important to stakeholders than to practitioners.
And very interesting to just see how low improved supplier relationships actually ranks. I guess we could probably debate that one for quite some time. But what about a few then key takeaways? Well, looks like mine have popped up first, Mike, so I guess I'll try and do a very quick commentary on what I thought there. So one of the things that didn't rank especially high on the practitioner's evaluation of important things is self-service. And to me, if we actually care about efficiency and care about freeing up our time to be able to do these higher value things, self-service is absolutely key to all of this. And of course, that's where the latest, greatest technologies can really begin to play a big part. I think we also, it's critical that we remember that risk is also about opportunity. And of course, innovation is risky. By its nature, innovation is doing new and different things. So it has risk associated with it. And as we think about the mitigation of risk, we do need to become perhaps a lot better at thinking about risk likelihood, but also the recognition that if we don't take risk, then we're not over time going to have a business to deal with. So simplification, Mike, you've mentioned friction points. We've done a lot of studies of friction points. They are the points where cost is incurred and where value gets eroded or missed. So understanding the friction points in our acquisition processes and really focusing on the ones that have the greatest economic impact on our business is, I think, a critical area for us all to focus on. And understanding stakeholders. This survey has once again reinforced the point that we're maybe not always having the right conversations with people. And again, a conversation I was having with a senior executive today said, stop talking about procure to pay, talk about need to pay. And I think that would be a great point on which to end my comments. Mike.
Yeah, mine are actually fairly similar to yours, Tim. I'll take them a little bit out of order maybe this time. I'm gonna start from the bottom and keep exploring the advances in technology. I think that technology is going to create the space for us to be a greater organization. So that technology is key for creating that space, and all these kind of follow in line from that is being able to invest time to understand the business of your stakeholders, similar to what you said, Tim. Understand value creation in contrast to cost savings, and look for technology to eliminate but simplify the areas of the process. Look for it to change up the way things are being done. I think being closer to the stakeholders in the business and actually being a value contributor and a revenue, possibly a revenue or profitability contributor, it would be seen as a value added function rather than just a function that has to happen. So I'll leave it with that. We're running thin on time.
Yeah, I'm just going to come in now, Tim and Mike. Thanks so much for this. This was really interesting, and I know there's plenty of chat coming up, and there were lots of audience participation and comments. I know, Mike, I think you might have to drop. So Tim, Molly, I have a couple of questions, and we have a few minutes left. I'll put the first one to you. This is from Frank Ibsen. He says, to what extent are framework agreements negotiated separate from the deliverables contracts used? Or is there a better way to work with the requirement to protect corporate entities? Interesting one. Tim, any thoughts?
Yes, there is a better way. I think, Paula, as you well know, I mean, we're seeing more and more the leaders in this space really thinking about intelligent clause libraries with fallbacks. And so have you got the makings of a framework agreement sitting in there? Well, yes, you have, but with intelligent systems, we don't need to any longer go with these 30-page frameworks. We can create core agreements that are much more specific to the nature of the industry, the type of acquisition that we're making, and which then maintain an accurate record of what clauses have been used and what hasn't been used in the original framework to supplement and adjust it over time. So I think we're looking at much more dynamic AI-powered clause libraries with automated fallbacks and options.
Yeah, I totally agree, Tim, and that's what I'm hearing when I talk to people as well. Although absolutely, and when you look at a lot of the big players, there is, and you talked about simplification earlier on, Tim, there is that desire for customers to negotiate agreements just once with their suppliers. So they very much like the concept of a framework agreement that covers all the stuff that they're generally going to include in agreements. But as you said, that agility for particular engagements with different clauses in and out to actually cater for the specifics of a particular engagement. So yeah, my experience definitely supports that. Also, Juliet Mayer, I thought had a very interesting comment. Juliet thinks that sometimes stakeholders see procurement as kind of less involved, and they're very much the hold up in the process. And she comments this in the context of why we see less in the stakeholder charts of very satisfied for procurement. But in actuality, stakeholders and stakeholder related delays often are part of the problem, decision making, etc., and how quickly that decision process is actually coming from top down back to procurement, so procurement can move forward. Any comments on that, Tim?
I completely agree, Juliet. But I also feel that a forward-looking, dynamic, high-value procurement function has the opportunity and should be taking advantage of the opportunity to measure those delays. We talked briefly about friction points, and of course this is exactly the point. You know, is it legal which is the hold-up? Is it because the requisitioning business unit actually doesn't really make its mind up? Is it because things are running perhaps in sequence when they could be in parallel? If we really want to raise our profile and raise the esteem, if you like, with which we're regarded, I think we do have to be much more visible, much more vocal. We have to be gathering, collecting, reporting the data and highlighting ways in which things can be improved. Otherwise, we will continue to get blamed. And, you know, one could argue we should be, because we should be problem solvers, bringing solutions to the business to drive improvement, whether or not it's immediately within the remit of our specific function.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you're talking about data, Tim, because we know it's really about the data. We know that there's a lot of data around, but we still know there's a little bit of a gap about how that data is used strategically within organizations to affect better outcomes. So I think AI can definitely help with that, and the development of AI we see is definitely helping with that. Well, unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions. We're completely at the top of the hour. I would just like to say thanks to all for attending. Tim, I'll hand over to you for a last word, but we've had lots of comments in the chat that they found this to be a great presentation with very interesting data.
I think it is very interesting data, and I'd certainly like to thank Orchid for initiating what has proven to be a very interesting survey. It's been a pleasure, obviously, working and sharing our thoughts and ideas as we constructed it. And I think there's a lot of data that's come out of this that is really useful and interesting. But of course, it also begs, as always, a whole lot more questions and areas where perhaps research should be undertaken. So certainly if anybody's got any further thoughts on what this should be provoking in terms of follow-on conversations or follow-on pieces of research, do get in touch with us. But meantime, would like to thank Molly, Mike, and the Orchid team, because it's been a great pleasure working with you, certainly on understanding the state of procurement, and particularly why, yes, we can deliver more value.
And actually, just Tim, sorry to interject before people drop off, there is another stage in this process, because we will be co-editing a joint white paper with Orchid, where we're actually going to drill down further into this data and hopefully come up with a deeper analysis and some solutions and ideas for ways forward for those on the call and beyond. So thank you all for attending, and watch this space. You will be hearing from us. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.